Broadcasting. Okay. Is this media or is this okay. Is this the ACCC policy behind it? And the department and Minister's office. Okay, I declare open this public hearing of the Joint Committee of the National Broadband Network and would like to thank the Chairman of the Australian Consumer and Competition Commission, Mr Rod Sims, and his colleagues for being here tonight, both at the table and behind. Before calling the first witnesses, I ask a committee member to move that the media be allowed to film the proceedings today in accordance with the rules set down for committees, which include not taking footage or still images of members' papers or laptop screens. Thanks, Michelle. And also that the committee authorise for publication and to be included in records of evidence the submissions received up until today, which have been circulated and details of which will be recorded in the minutes. Thanks, Michelle, as well. I now welcome the witnesses from the ACCC. For the Hansard record, could you please state your names and the capacity in which you appear before the committee?
Rod Sims, Chairman of the ACCC.
Ed Willett, Commissioner, Australian Competition and Consumer Commission.
Michael Cosgrave, Group General Manager, Communications Group with the ACCC.
Rose Swerb, Executive General Manager, Merger and Adjudications with the ACCC.
Okay, thanks again for coming, and although the committee does not require you to give evidence under oath, I advise you that these hearings are formal proceedings of the Parliament and warrant the same respect as proceedings of the respective houses. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. Would Mr Sims, you like to make an opening statement to the committee or any of your colleagues?
Look, I would, Chairman, if I could. Thank you. I do so because I'm conscious that the authorisation decision that we made in relation to the Optus NBN agreements did attract understandable controversy, so I just thought I'd go to that issue because we do understand that for an organisation that's intrinsically very pro-market, very pro-competition, that we've authorised an agreement which allows NBN to essentially buy out its competitor, albeit one that passes 15% of premises. And so I just thought I'd give an understanding of the, I guess, unusual legislative and institutional circumstances behind the decision, because, as I say, I know people are interested in it. Yeah. I thought I'd just say up front that, of course, if one's interested in fixed line competition, the key issue or the game changer, I guess, was the Telstra agreement, structural separation undertaking, which was, of course, facilitated by legislation. Our role in relation to that was really to make sure there was interim equivalence and transparency, which we did, and access seekers were fairly pleased with that outcome. And we also ensured that there's no impediments to any wireless competition that may be there, both in the Telstra SSU and in the Optus NBN agreement. But turning to the decision, under the Act, what we have to do is weigh the benefits and detriments of the authorisation, and we do that by comparing the world with the authorisation and the world as best we judge it without the authorisation, and compare the benefits and detriments and weigh those two up. Now, our reasoning was underpinned by three, I guess, sort of foundation conclusions we drew. One was that the NBN would roll out as it would anyway, with or without the authorisation. That was essentially a view formed on the basis that in the areas where the Optus HFC exists, it's relatively well-off neighbourhoods, that 15% of Australian premises, and that even though Optus has a third of the customers, there's still 2/3 that NBN would want to sign up, and it would be worth their while to roll out. And that at the time we made the judgment, it seemed a clear point to us. Secondly, we made the view that Optus would not extend the HFC beyond those 15% of premises, and that's because if they were to do so, the legislation says that they must be wholesale only, and that would preclude them from then providing retail services off that, and so it's something that they wouldn't contemplate. So that was a fairly easy judgment to make. And thirdly, we judged that Optus wouldn't invest to substantially upgrade the speed of the HFC network, and that when their customers wanted much higher speeds, they would migrate them to the NBN. At some stage, that would mean that the critical mass of customers on the HFC would be such that it would be not economic to continue with the HFC. So those were the three judgments we made on all the evidence in front of us, and they're key judgments for the purpose of the decision. Then we had to weigh the benefits and the detriments. The benefits of the authorisation were that it is, on the evidence available to us, noticeably less expensive with operating and stay-in-business capital costs to service the customers via the NBN than it is the HFC. That said, because NBN has to price a uniform price across the country, it will still be cheaper for Optus to continue servicing its customers on the HFC. So there's a difference between the private and social costs, as it were, and so that difference between the costs of servicing those customers via the NBN and the Optus HFC constitutes the benefit of authorisation. Now, we're not saying it's huge, but we're saying it's clear, it's a noticeable benefit. Then we have to weigh up the detriments. I mean, there's been some commentators, some of the newspaper reporters that have said, well, if you want to use that argument of benefit, you'd allow Coles to take over Woolworths. But of course, the benefits are much larger in this type of infrastructure, but much more importantly, for just about any other transaction, the detriments would swamp the benefits. Here they don't for particular reasons. We judged there were three sets of potential detriments in the sense that because we're removing competition, that would cause a detriment. We judged that detriment to be small, and we weighed it under three headings. The first heading was, would there be competition between network capability and network coverage between the NBN and the HFC? For reasons I've just said, we judged there would not be. Optus really would not extend the HFC, and we judged would not undertake the significant investment to significantly increase the speed. Secondly, would there be price-based competition? Well, here, Optus argued very strongly they had to stick to a uniform price across the country. Nonetheless, we could see ways where they could lower their price in the HFC area versus the non-HFC area to attract and maintain their customers. But the significant point is, whatever they did in relation to price competition, it was quite clear to us that NBN would not respond. You wouldn't get a competitive response. And the reason for that is NBN are required to offer a uniform price. And because they must offer a uniform price, if they responded to the Optus competition, they'd have to lower their price right across the board in all of Australia, not just the 15% where the Optus HFC is, and so therefore it would not be economic for them to match that price. Likewise, and lastly, in the non-price service area, we judged the main service benefits were things like faster call-outs, more reliable service, but really in a network business, when the main competition is occurring at the retail level, we judged that that would not be that visible to customers and not be that large. And the further significant point is, even if Optus was outperforming the NBN in those dimensions, NBN wouldn't match it because, again, they'd have to provide whatever they provide right across the board. So, to finish, we had to weigh up the benefits and detriments. This was an extremely difficult decision. It was much based on particularly our assessment of the detriments by the circumstances of the legislation, the uniform pricing, and we had also to make a practical judgment, not a theoretical one. On theory, you go one way. When you actually try and work out how you measure these detriments, we found that they weren't large enough to offset the benefits. So, Chairman, that's my opening statement.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks for that. And you may have answered my only question before handing to others in your opening statement, but following the release of the corporate plan last week, at the very least there could have been a perception formed by some that a 4% cost increase and a 6-month delay is all the ACCC's fault. So I'll just throw you the opportunity on the record to respond to, at the very least, that perception, if you wanted to add anything other than what you've mentioned in your opening statement?
Oh no, I'm keen to, Mr Chairman. I think that really is if you don't mind me saying, a slightly different point in the sense that any delay that I've heard potentially attributed to us was potentially the delay in approving the Telstra structural separation undertaking. That took us about 6 to 7 months to approve. I think it was 6.5 months to approve. My understanding was the original NBN timetable meant that they would have that would all be settled by the middle of 2011. As it happened, it never came to us until the end of July, so we never even had it. So to have even approved it in 1 month would have meant we've just closed our eyes and signed. But in fact, because we were trying to get interim equivalence and transparency, it was necessarily a complicated issue. I can understand that NBN were forecasting on the basis of an agreement that actually had to be settled between the ACCC and Telstra. So they may have found that hard to judge. But I think the key delay was the negotiations between NBN and Telstra. Our role necessarily was always going to take an amount of time, whether that was 4 or 5, 6, 9 months. These things do take time. So I don't think we contributed to the delay at all, Mr Chairman.
Okay, thanks. Deputy Chair.
Just with the Optus agreement, can you give us some more detail about the public benefit that's happened through that and compare that to any, any issues that may relate from that? Not a comparison, but just some more detail about how that's benefiting the rollout.
Yeah, I'll do that. One of the issues that I always have with our authorisations, they are a net cost benefit test, and they're a term of art themselves. But the benefit was that, from society's point of view, so you don't look at the private cost, you look at society's point of view. And as I emphasise, this is just the benefit to which you've got to offset the detriment. But the benefit was the difference in cost of serving the HFC customers by the HFC versus by the NBN. Now, unfortunately, all the data we got from NBN and Optus was confidential. They wouldn't allow us to release it, which makes it very hard to release the numbers and allow the proper transparency that we normally would. But it was that there was a noticeable difference in the two. The NBN is a new network, just been rolled out. It's obviously got its operating and stay in business capital costs, but the HFC is an older network, different form of network, and the costs were larger. We have a fair bit of technical expertise within the ACCC to assess these things, and we formed the view that there was that clear benefit. As I say, normally that wouldn't get you across the line, but here we face the unusual situation that the detriments from loss of competition were lower than they normally are by quite a long way.
Malcolm.
Mr Sims, if Optus was unlikely to compete on price, as you concluded, how could there be any risk of cherry picking?
We're not that much concerned about cherry picking. What we expect Optus would do. I mean, Optus has about 400,000 broadband customers on that line.
They're adding them. They added 7,000, they reported today.
I beg your pardon?
They added another 7,000, so they're still recruiting them.
Oh, it's in their interest to get customers on their HFC line. I mean, they'll be competing at a retail level against Telstra and iiNet and all the rest to get customers in those 1.3 million premises. They have about 400,000 now. I mean, how much of the market they can get using the HFC when they're competing at a retail level is a matter of judgment. It's in their interest to price just below, they don't want to give away too much price because that's giving away profit, but they may try and price just below the NBN price that goes to other players to keep those customers and make maximum profit. So we judge that there wouldn't be much in it.
Okay, but if cherry picking's not the issue, what possible detriment is there by leaving the competition in place? I mean, the Commission has always traditionally said that where competition is limited, as it is in this area, and where there are obviously statutory barriers to further competition, it's important to preserve what competition there is. And here you are, you've agreed to $2 billion going from the taxpayer to Singtel and wiping out competition over 15% of the market.
Look, that's why I publicly said this was an extremely difficult decision. At first glance, it is a serious takeout of the main competitor and not something that sits comfortably with us.
Well, hang on, you said it's at first glance. What is it at second glance? What is it? No,
Well,
no, sorry, okay.
well, he was just about to finish. I wanted to hear the end of that comment.
Well, the point is we have to weigh the benefits with the detriments under the authorisation test. That is there a net benefit from the arrangement? And so we had to find. I mean, normally, whenever a party in this situation, as it were, buys out its main competitor, the detriments are enormous in terms of price competition, non-price competition, dynamic effects from both the player that's still there and the one that's coming. But here, very difficult for NBN to respond because they have to provide a universal price and service across the country. So you lose a lot of the dynamic response from NBN. And then from Optus's point of view, we judged they weren't going to roll out the HFC any further, and I think that really is quite clear that under the legislation they have no incentive to do that. And the amount they'd need to invest to match the higher level services is something that, again, we judged they wouldn't do. So it's a very unusual situation. And if you look at it from Optus's point of view, one way to look at this is if the NBN had been rolled out as an open access network first, if that was the first investment made, would Optus subsequently want to invest in a HFC? Well, I doubt they would because this is an open access fibre network. So Optus is making those judgments all the time about whether they would compete against something that's been overbuilt against them. So it's a very unusual situation.
So what's the detriment? Just in summary, what is if by leaving the competition in place, what is the detriment?
The detriment is the difference in cost of serving the customers.
The difference in cost to whom?
To society. Basically, the use of economic inputs to provide the service. There's extra operating costs and extra stay in business investment.
But hang on, but the cost to the NBN is the same in either scenario because your assumption is the NBN is going to build out in those areas in any event, correct?
That's the capital cost. But to service the HFC customers, they would have to spend money.
No, the NBN we're talking about.
There's two scenarios we were comparing. Either the 400,000 may turn out to be 500,000 customers get their network service from the HFC, in which case to do that there's both operating costs and stay in business investment because obviously the core network is a sunk cost.
But that cost is Optus's?
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
And then the cost that's NBN's, if they were to service those customers, is much lower. And that's NBN's costs, I agree. But in doing an authorisation test, a benefit is that society is expending less resources if the NBN does it than if the Optus does it. In these net benefit tests, we're not fussed about, just as the money that's paid is a complete transfer. The money paid is not relevant to the calculation. It's all about are extra resources going to service those customers. As I say, it is its own world, these authorisation tests.
But, Mr Sims, the cost of allowing competition to continue would largely be borne by Optus, correct?
No, it's borne by society because there's more inputs, more factors of production that have to go to provide the operating costs and investment costs if the HFC services the customers than if the NBN services.
But hang on, who pays for the cost of servicing the HFC? Is that society or is it Optus? I thought it belonged to Optus.
That does belong to Optus, that's right.
So the cost of checks are actually written by Optus, correct?
In that case, yes, they are.
Right.
Yes.
So why did you regard it as being in the public interest for $2 billion of taxpayers' money to be paid to Optus in order to save Optus expense? If Optus was going to be overbuilt and put out of business, which is your assumption, which of course is heroic because it assumes the NBN will be completed, but you've just assumed that, with broadband schemes all around the world slowing and being changed, and this one proceeding at a snail's pace, you've just assumed it's all going to go ahead in accordance with their plan. But even assuming that, if the Optus network is going to be overbuilt and ultimately put out of business, isn't that the risk of Singtel and its shareholders in Singapore? Why on earth is it in the Australian public interest for $2 billion to be paid to Singapore, or indeed any other private company?
Look, just to deal with what I think are 3 points there, our view we form, not an assumption, that the NBN would roll out anyway, is based on current policy. We can't assume that governments changes or policy change. All we can assume is what's there in front of us.
Well, can I just no. I just want to no, but
Yep.
He said 3 points. Let him say the 3 points, please. And then you can banter.
We've had many discussions.
Yes,
we know each other very well.
Malcolm's my local member, so we know each other well.
I'm
yes.
simply trying. I just want to not lose that point. But Mr. Sim, just on that point, on the assumption though, you've got to form a judgment about commercial exigencies and things that may happen. And we understand that.
Yes.
But why wouldn't it be a relevant consideration for the ACCC just to think that maybe this project may not continue in the way it is planned? Why is that the one view of the future that is frozen in stone?
Can you, and just for the exercise, can you answer your 3 points and come back to that?
I won't
because
interrupt
there's
you
others who would like to hear
sure,
what the original answer was going to be.
Okay.
And then feel free to come back to
could I
how
do that
you've
one
got to deal
first
with.
before I? I'll do the.
It's up to you.
I'll
It's
do
up
the
to
three
you.
if I can
But
remember.
please don't
the
lose
third
that
one.
first thought.
Anyway, look, the difficulty is the only circumstances we have in front of us are what is NBN doing at the moment, what are they planning to do at the moment. The only way we could assume that something else might happen, frankly, would be to, I think, be speculating in the extreme. I mean, to take what I think is a rather strange example, I mean, if we were to assume that possibly the government might change, imagine writing that one up. If we to assume that NBN might want to adopt a different mandate from what their shareholder had given them. I mean, all we can do, like any organisation, is run with what the policy is at the time. I'm afraid that's the best answer I can give anyway. I can give, and the NBN, the HFC areas are quite wealthy areas, so we think the NBN would want to be there even to get the 2/3 of customers, because they'll be more likely to want higher speeds than people in the rest of the country.
Well, can I just want to hear this 3
I'll be quick.
points,
I'll be
and
quick.
then
I'll be quick.
Feel free to.
We weren't concerned about the risk of them going out of business. What we were saying that over time, as people wanted higher speeds, Optus would transfer its customers off the HFC onto the NBN, but we don't know when that is. It may be 10 or 20 years out. We don't know. Thirdly, the point about the amount of money paid. As I say, that is a transfer under cost-benefit analysis. The fact that money goes from one party to another doesn't really matter. Cost-benefit analysis, and I know this is weird to say it, but it is the way it works. It's all about society's inputs and how much inputs does it take to do something, and there's less inputs if it's the NBN than if it is the HFC. It doesn't matter who does what. In economics, transfers are not relevant. In any productivity commission, cost-benefit analysis, they'd approach it the same way. I'm not saying they might reach the same conclusion, but they would have the same methodology. They wouldn't count the transfer. They would focus on society's costs. They would approach it the same way. Whether they came to the same balancing or not is another matter. But
Doug,
they would
did you
have
want to
to.
chip in quickly with an angle?
Yeah,
and then
it's a very quick question. On that question that Mr Turnbull asked about, and let me put it this way, but you should speculate on what might happen. Does the ACCC do that with any company that you're dealing with mergers and the like?
We have to form, I mean, this is where it gets tricky, Senator. We have to form judgments about what we think will happen in the commercial world what I'm really saying here is you've got government ownership of the NBN. That owner wants certain things to happen. Given that, we looked at NBN's incentives in that world and we said that's the way it will play out. What we couldn't do is speculate about changes of government. In terms of, you know, a commercial enterprise in a merger, we may well say, well, if something happens, they might respond this way. So we can look forward, but we have, in our framework, no basis for talking about such a fundamental change. You know, the shareholder of the NBN has a clear policy. NBN is working in a clear way. We had no basis to say that they would make that change.
So you're confident you made a robust analysis of the issues that were before you and you dealt with it in a proper manner?
We absolutely did, and we, while I've said this was an extremely difficult decision, we think we've made the right decision.
Thanks. Scott, did you have any questions? Yep. On this or related
on this
topics?
subject, because I'm actually not at all clear the response that you gave to Mr Turnbull. I mean, that question was uppermost in my mind as well. I get the public benefit argument. I even get the public, the competition argument, and I can understand why it would be a line ball from the point of view of competition regulator. But how does the answer that you provided with Mr Turnbull get back to his basic premise? The NBN Co proposed to comprehensively overbuild such HFC networks as Optus has in the ground, and that would have put them out of business, presumably, put that section, that portion of their operations out of business. So we are buying them out, and yes, there'll be greater public benefit, people in that footprint will have the option and so on, but I don't know, the cheque doesn't go to society, the cheque doesn't go to the model, the cheque goes to one commercial operator.
But what's happening here is it wouldn't put Optus out of business. There's a lot of complexity around this. It wouldn't put Optus out of business because even though NBN's incremental costs are lower than the HFC's, because NBN has to have a uniform price right across the country, that means that it's still cheaper for Optus to use the HFC. So Optus would use that HFC for 10, 20 years. So essentially, the money that NBN was paying was basically to bring forward the revenues that it could get from those HFC customers that without this agreement it would not get. So that's why NBN paid the money over. How much money they paid over and whether it's the right amount is a matter for them. But they were bringing forward a revenue stream they wouldn't otherwise get.
But from a competition point of view, and I'm in favour of the uniform wholesale pricing model that the NBN's put up. I think that
makes a very big difference in this case.
Well, I imagine it would, but nonetheless, if I'm in the area of the Optus footprint and NBN turns up offering me a service that's cheaper, faster, greater upload speeds and so on, that is going to rapidly cannibalise at least the premium end of the market that is currently being served by Optus.
No, but 2 points, Senator. First of all, NBN aren't competing. NBN can't provide retail services.
Right.
They're just providing the backbone. So the customer never
Sure.
sees the NBN, the customer never sees the
No, I
HFC.
understand that.
They're going to see Telstra versus iiNet versus Optus, and we hope a bunch of new entrants.
Yeah.
But the second point is, because NBN must offer a uniform price right across the country, it won't be able to price match and price according to its costs. It's also got to recover its build cost as well. It's also got to get a return on its capital cost.
But
so it will price above the HFC.
Okay, perhaps for an identical service.
Pardon?
But for an identical service.
A service that customers will find very difficult to differentiate unless they want much higher speeds.
Right, but the point being NBN Co's RSPs will be able to offer much higher speeds. So what I'm putting to you is at the premium end of the market, Optus's HFC network won't be able to compete. You won't be able to offer those speeds. That's why we're putting the glass in the first place.
It's a question, Senator, of how quickly that will happen. I mean, right at the moment, with 400,000 customers, they can offer certain speeds on the HFC, which people on my right or left can explain better than I can. But how long will it take before enough people migrate who want the very high speeds? That's the difficult judgment. And the judgment of I think NBN, Optus and ourselves was that would take some time so that Optus would continue to provide services for some time and just sit there and make the difference between its price, the cost to it of the HFC and what NBN is actually charging, which is higher than cost.
I'm sure other members have questions, but could you just spell out for us in language that non-economists will understand the public benefit argument that you're putting?
Yeah, okay. in an economic cost-benefit analysis, it is just that society has a limited number of resources. That's why whenever the Productivity Commission looks at tariff debates, one of the irritating assumptions it makes that confuses everybody is it assumes full employment, because it basically says that everyone is fully employed, because of course if they weren't fully employed, then employing them in the car industry, for example, would give them a job. So they assume full employment because they assume that ultimately all the resources in society are fully employed. The same here. So the fact that there's less resources of society, be it labour, be it capital, to provide the service by the NBN than the HFC is that public benefit. We need less resources to provide to do the job.
I'd rather have the economist's argument.
Yeah, I'll keep working on it. Thank you.
Am I right listening to you just on this question of uniform wholesale pricing? Am I right to conclude that you would have drawn a different conclusion if there wasn't uniform wholesale pricing?
Yep.
Okay, Mr. Fletcher.
Mr. Sims, the process that you went through, this was not a competition analysis that you might conduct, for example, for a merger application, was it?
Correct. It's a net benefit test, that's right.
So it's not a substantial lessening of competition test?
Correct. It's not in any way.
It would have been open to the parties to seek approval on that basis, wouldn't it?
No, I don't think so. The only basis for them to... the reason they have to get... Australia is fairly unique in terms of its ability for people to ask for an authorisation for what, in the absence of that authorisation, would be a breach of the Act.
Yep.
So this agreement would be a breach of the Act, but for the authorisation.
So let me just understand that.
Sorry, do you want to have a shot at this? I should pass to the
It
real
potentially
expert here.
would have been an anti-competitive agreement
Yes.
that could have substantially lessened competition rather than a merger or something like that.
Well, that's what I want to understand.
Yeah,
that the starting point is the whole reason they're going through it for an authorisation
Correct.
is because otherwise it would be anti-competitive.
It would have breached Section 45 of the Act. Absolutely.
Or in the view of the parties, there's a substantial risk that...
In other words, the parties have chosen to go the authorisation route because their assessment was, had they not done that, it would have been in breach of the Act as anti-competitive.
Yes.
Okay.
I think they must have done, otherwise
Yeah, why
why
would
did
they
they
come?
bother? Yes.
Okay, so then the question becomes, why is the competition regulator waving through something that's anti-competitive? And you've put to us that you're required to weigh up benefit and detriment. And I think, if I'm hearing you correctly, what you've said to us is essentially that NBN is such a good thing that you want to bring forward as soon as possible getting all the customers on NBN who otherwise would be Optus's customers. Is that what you said?
No, I'm sorry, that's not right.
I misunderstood you.
I've never said NBN's a good thing or anything like it one way or the other. We have under our... that's right, one way or the other. We have... that's not a debate for us. We have... under our legislation, and as I say, it's fairly unique, the ability for parties to come forward where they form the view that something could be a breach of an Act and get that behaviour authorised. Uniquely under the authorisation test, it's a net benefit test. So yes, there's detriments,
sure,
but are there benefits that offset it?
Understanding that, I'm just trying to make sure I'm understanding what you've defined as the benefit. I thought I heard you say that your assessment was that a consequence of this deal being approved was that the customers would be served over the NBN rather than over the Optus HFC network, and that was lower cost and that brought social benefits.
Yeah, if we... the benefit of the deal is that customers are serviced by the NBN, which draws less of society's resources to service than the HFC does on the evidence available to us. That's right.
Okay, so the one question I want to ask you is, why did you not conclude that if things proceeded without the deal being authorised, Optus would have been unable to continue in the business and therefore the customers would have ended up on the NBN anyway, and the benefit would have arrived without you needing to approve this deal?
I'm sorry, Could you just repeat that again? I
Well,
missed
if
that.
I'm understanding your logic,
Yeah.
you've essentially said a benefit of the deal is that it means that that the 400,000 customers, for argument's sake, will be served over the NBN, which is a lower cost way of serving them than over the Optus HFC network. An alternative path to get to that outcome would presumably have been that the two companies continue to operate, NBN and Optus.
Yep.
If your thesis is correct and NBN is lower cost, Optus will presumably be unable to sustain its business and the customers will end up on the NBN anyway.
Yep. No, because you see that's the quirk here. You've got the NBN stay in business costs, you've got the HFC stay in business cost, but then you've got the NBN's price because it's got to charge a uniform price and also it's got to recover its capital costs. So the NBN is going to charge more because of those two reasons than the HFC's cost to stay in business. It just so happens that the NBN's actual costs, the actual call on society's resources is down here, but the price they'll charge is up there. So NBN, if we had not authorised the deal, our judgment is that the HFC would have stayed there for some hard to determine period, 10, 20 years or whatever.
We would ordinarily look, wouldn't we, to prices in the market to determine what was the most efficient resource allocation?
Correct, we would.
So it's an unusual outcome, isn't it, that
Yes.
essentially you've got a regulator saying we can determine better than prices in the market what is the lowest cost allocation of resources.
That's not what's happening. What's happening here is that, to use, I'm afraid, the economic jargon, which I think worked better than the non-economic jargon, there is I thought that. There's a market failure here, to use the technical terms. Normally, if the market was working properly, you'd be right. That's exactly what would happen. The lower cost business would displace the higher cost business. There'd be no issue here. The market failure is that the HFC costs are sunk. All they have to cover for Optus, all Optus incurs when it uses its HFC is those incremental costs, both investment and operating costs. The HFC in this situation is going to charge more than that because it has to recover its new capital costs.
So the NBN will charge more.
Sorry, the NBN,
Yes.
I'm sorry,
Yeah.
has to cover its new capital costs as well as its operating costs, and it's got to charge a uniform price. So we have this unusual situation where the market can't sort it out. There's a market failure because of that particular set of circumstances.
So is an implication of this that customers who are on the Optus HFC now could find themselves paying higher retail prices for the same service?
Look, we don't think there's much in that because we think it's in Optus's interest to make that margin itself.
Did you look at any retail pricing issues in relation to uniform wholesale pricing and the implications of that in any of these considerations?
Well, uniform national pricing is going to,
But at
by
wholesale,
NBN, is
yeah.
going to flow through to the retail level, if I understand you correctly, Mr Chairman, but I'm not, maybe I...
Yeah.
Sorry, Mr Sims, can I just follow up
But
on that?
Well, hang on. Flow through up. I just want to clarify.
Yeah, sure, yeah.
I just want to follow up on that previous question and your answer. Is it an implication of what you've said that today there are customers on the Optus HFC network who are paying a particular retail price for a particular broadband service who are at risk of having to pay more for an equivalent retail service delivered over the NBN?
We judged that there wasn't much in that because we judge, I mean, NBN is under, in the discussions we're having with them, are going to hold their basic level prices at pretty much what they are now, and we judged that there wasn't really much in it for Optus to price much below that. Much better to just sit below or sit on that price and make the margin and keep the margin. Because they've got 400,000 customers now.
Isn't it really quite curious that a competition regulator should be proposing to take the word of a monopolist as to how customers are going to get the cheapest possible prices and actually encourage the exit of a competitor that is presently delivering a retail service?
We have to weigh up the benefits and the detriments. We have to make a practical assessment of how big those detriments are. And this is a very unusual set of circumstances. I keep emphasising that. There's bits of legislation that affect this. There's uniform national pricing that affects this. We, at the end of the day, I mean, you first look at this when it comes through the door and you say this is, as you say, it's anti-competitive. That's in fact why it was coming through the door. But we have to weigh up and be able to as it were, put our hand on our hearts and say that we can see competitive detriments that offset the benefit that's just sitting there that we can easily calculate. And we were just, in the end of the day, not able to do that.
Can I ask you, just one more question, Mr Chairman, last question. One of the benefits you cited, I think, was environmental benefits. Could you just amplify that?
I don't think it had a big role to play. I agree we did say it, but do you remember what they were?
It was a marginal benefit that there will be less energy use through the NBN than on the HFC network, but that was a very marginal consideration in the whole decision.
Tip the decision.
No.
But again, this is a net benefit test. It has to take into account all wider benefits to society. It's in fact a good example of how the test comes about. It's not a commercial thing. It's not what customers are paying. It takes the society-wide point of view. We got put to us a wide range of potential benefits from the parties. That one we felt had something in it, not a lot, so we mentioned it in the report, but it didn't drive the decision.
Okay, Mike Simon.
Thank you, Chair. Mr Sims, I'd like to change the discussion around the points of interconnect, if I may, and ask a couple of questions in relation to the recommendation from the ACCC that the government picked up to increase the number of points of interconnect to 121, but also to ask the competitive reasonings, I suppose, behind that. What made it better in the ACCC's view that there was a greater number rather than a lesser number? And I'll ask a couple of questions after that, if I may.
And I'm going to pass to my colleagues on my left and right because they were here at the time and I was not. So they'll do a better job of answering your question.
There was at least 3 different perspectives in relation to an approach to the questions of point of interconnections. There was a fully distributed approach, which means effectively in current parlance in each exchange service area you'd have a point of interconnection, about 600 in all. There was inevitably, if you wish to compete nationally and you've got to get to 600 points, there's costs involved in that. There was an approach advocated by NBN that broadly saw traffic being picked up at 5 points of interconnection in the capital cities, and arguably NBN Co having to build an extensive transit network. But that may have had some impact upon NBN Co's ability to deliver uniform national wholesale pricing. The approach the Commission recommended to government was a semi-distributed approach, which involved a competition test that effectively looked at existing providers of backhaul in the market. And made a judgment on where points of interconnection should be based essentially on, and this is probably oversimplifying it, but based essentially on where there was the prospect of competitive backhaul provision.
So from there, and I'm just trying to extrapolate that, the benefit was seen to be at the retail end, as I understand that answer, because there is less cost involved for an RSP to become a part of an NBN supplied service. Is that the reason?
No, that wasn't the central. Again, we were looking at a range of competition factors. An important competition factor was the presence of alternate backhaul providers, in this case people such as Optus, NextGen, who were able to provide backhaul services.
Just again on the same issue, there's a line on one of the submissions we have from the ACCC about the proposal to keep the physical address of each POI confidential, and I was wondering why that has to be the case.
Well, that's a matter currently under consideration. So we don't yet have a view. We've put that out for consideration. That was advocated to us by NBN Co on the advice, as I understand it, of the Attorney General's Department citing security concerns.
I just found it interesting comparing it to a current Telstra exchange, for instance.
Well, I'm told, I think it's advocated that we don't actually put out the address of Telstra exchanges at the moment.
Except they stand out pretty well, don't they?
We
But
do notice them.
I understand what you're putting. We've put it out there because it's been put to us in fairly strong terms. We'll see whether people have concerns about it. I wouldn't put it as one of the issues about which we have particularly strong views either way.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Senator Campbell.
Yeah, Mr. Sims, I want to come back to this issue of market failure. We spoke about market failure in a narrow aspect of the HFC issue, but there's a broader issue of market failure that's been evident in the telecommunications industry for a number of years, isn't there?
Sorry?
There's a broader issue of market failure in telecommunications in Australia that's been there for years. That is Telstra's vertical integration. That would be a market failure as well, wouldn't it? Competition wasn't effective.
Look, I guess that's right.
Would you call that a market failure, Michael?
Well, the Commission's long expressed concerns around Telstra's vertical
Is
integration.
this the Productivity Commission?
No, the
you're
ACCC has. I mean,
Yeah.
look, we have concerns whenever you have vertical integration, parties competing in one segment of the market and one of them owning bottleneck infrastructure in another. We have that concern in telecommunications. We have it in relation to wheat ports in South Australia and Western Australia. So that is an issue of general concern.
Mm-hmm. So that market failure was there for well over a decade, maybe longer. The government took a position to deal with vertical integration so that we could actually put the broadband in place, so that broadband could be, where the market had failed to supply broadband across the country, the government then, under the theory, government should intervene if there's market failure, or can intervene in a period of market failure, and that's what the government did, isn't that correct?
Well, look, Senator, there's an active debate politically about what the best way was to solve that problem. The government has an approach with the NBN. As we understand it, the opposition has a different approach. I don't really want to get in the middle of that debate.
That's a shame.
But the point is that having a as I understand it, there is universal support for some idea of having a standalone network provider so that you can get competition. All else aside, having a market where you don't have someone who's in that vertically integrated position and can leverage their position from one market to another, if we can get rid of that, that is a plus. I should hasten to add it wasn't relevant to the decision we made with the authorisation, which was its own terms.
Yeah.
But yes, getting rid of that is a plus.
And there'll be more retail competition in telecommunications than previously.
I think compared to the world you have now, if you have a standalone network business so that the retailers aren't linked to the network provider, that, all things equal, should allow more competition at the retail level, yes.
Thanks.
Thanks, Chair. Quickly return to the Optus HFC authorisation, and then I'm sure there are some SAU and other questions that I or others will have. But just to be quite clear here, your view, Mr Sims, is that were the Optus HFC network to continue operating for the next 10, 15, 20 years, Optus would behave in a manner where it undercuts the price of NBN Co services so as to maintain some of its 400,000 subscribers or as many of its potential 1.4 million homes that it currently passes?
We judge they probably wouldn't do that much, Senator. We judge that that the competition is going to occur at the retail level, as we were just discussing, between Optus and iiNet and Telstra and all the rest. Optus has got about a third of those customers at the moment. We judged that they would try and hang on to them and keep their price as high as they possibly could, keeping in mind that to lower the price at the retail level would require them to be very careful about how they're marketing to people when they're using the HFC in the 15% of Australia and when they're using the NBN in the other 85%. So we judged they would not price that much differently and just sit there and earn the margin, and quite happily do that for as long as they could. And we judged that would be some time.
Okay. So you don't think there's a particular, you don't see a particular benefit that would have necessarily existed for consumers in that scenario, but your argument essentially is that closing down that network would provide, well, essentially backs up the provision of the uniform national pricing by NBN Co, makes it easier for them to achieve those objectives?
No, no. The NBN has to price uniformly. So whether the agreement goes ahead or not, that's what's going to happen. So we judged that there wasn't much of a price effect for the Optus HFC customers. What we were very clear on was that even if there was, NBN wasn't going to lower its price to match it, because they have to apply a uniform national price. So there may have been a little bit of competitive gain there, but we didn't think it was much, because we could just see what Optus is. So we weren't taking their word for it. We were making our own commercial judgment. You know, what would we do in this situation? Well, I know what I'd do. I'd sit there and price at about the same price, hang on to my third customers, trying to get, you know, massively more than a third in this area. Difficult to do given that the competition's occurring at the retail level and Optus is just one of many retail competitors. Difficult judgments, I know.
Indeed. Surely Optus would behave in a manner where they would attempt to maximise revenue off of that HFC network, and that might be maintaining the approximately 1/3 of the potential customers at a small price differential. It might be being able to double that at a slightly greater price differential.
Absolutely, that's true. We judge, though, that given that this is competition occurring at the retail level, that Optus is one of a large number of retail consumers. Optus would have to make that judgment about where's the trade-off between the number of customers and the price difference. The second problem Optus would have is justifying in their national campaigns how they're pricing differently in one area than another. Now, the second issue may not be that large, but the first one, their profit maximising behaviour, we judge, was to hang on to the customers they've got, potentially try and get a few more with a few service enhancements, possibly a little bit on price, but basically keep that margin. A difficult judgment, but we had to make one.
And you accept there would have been some difference for consumers in the service area that comprises 1.4 million homes.
We mentioned in our detriments that that we were weighing against the benefits, that there may have been some modest price issue, and there may well have been some service issues. But how much service a customer notices on a broadband is difficult to know. I mean, how often do you call out the serviceman? I mean, it happens a bit, don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to say it's irrelevant. We just had to judge how big was it, try and quantify it and compare it to the benefits. So something there certainly, Senator.
So in the end, Optus gets simply paid to leave the market, and those consumers will have to pay whatever that difference may have been over that 10, 15, 20-year timeline that could have been the life of the HFC.
Because we have to weigh up the benefits in terms of that use of society's resources with the competitive gain. That's the job we have.
Certainly. It's not an insignificant number of premises at stake here either, is it? It's not.
It's 400,000 broadband customers they've got at the moment. I'm told now it's 400,007.
Going up.
Yeah, it went up.
Well, look, I don't know that it
We've got a...
No, I'll tell you. You've asked the question. It's
We've got 10 minutes.
It's 433,000. It was 426 in June 2011, and it's now 433,000.
Yep.
So the telephony customers have been declining, broadband customers going up.
Last question on this point from me then. In a merger scenario, would you accept this type of buying out of perfectly functional infrastructure in favour of consumers potentially having to pay more?
Look, do you want to...
It would be a different test, Senator. In a merger scenario, it would be see if there was a substantial lessening of competition and making a decision about that or not. In this case, it was agreed there was a substantial lessening of competition, and because they sought authorisation, we were weighing the benefits and the detriments.
Thank you.
Is the ACCC on the record with a view about uniform wholesale pricing generally?
I don't think I've ever said anything, have we?
Do you want to be?
Well, look, it's a social judgment.
That's right. I'm just wondering whether the ACCC specifically with
this
your
issue
charter.
comes up all the time. If government wants to spread prices, they do it in Queensland with network charges. It's not something. It's a social issue, not an economic issue. It's not something. It's not a policy we endorse. It probably has its efficiency costs. So as far as we're concerned, it does have efficiency costs. I'm speaking generally now, Chairman, about uniform pricing generally. But it's a perfectly legitimate thing for governments to decide to do, and they do it quite often.
Okay.
More specifically?
We made some observations around it in our POIS advice to government. Mr Sims wasn't there at the time, but it was pretty close to what he just said. We set out various ways in which those objectives can be achieved through direct policies, through subsidies, as you'd expect us to do.
Okay. I'm sweeping the room. I think everyone who's wanted to, before we go a second lap, Senator McDonald, you were late. Did you want anything? So second goes, Scott, and then Paul, and we might call it a wrap after that.
And this is probably going to sound a little bit pedantic, but I still don't completely understand. I think, without trying to verbal you told us before that Optus's price would be slightly lower than NBN Co's, because NBN Co's got to pay for the cost of universal service, whereas Optus is just basically cherry-picked, and as you would do, and gone after the
I'm saying that
areas.
When Optus is servicing its retail customers, Optus would pay the NBN more because of that universal price than it would cost it, Optus, to run the HFC. So Optus has an incentive to use its HFC. That's its private incentive.
Yeah, okay. So in that case, I guess I don't understand how you can then say that it's going to be more competitive, or how people within the HFC footprint will be better off with Optus removed, even though their costs are lower.
I don't think we said it was going to be more competitive with Optus removed.
No, sorry, not more competitive. I know that's the whole purpose of what's going on here. But how you could be so confident that prices wouldn't go up at least a bit for people who would then have higher wholesale costs underneath them than they had with the HFC?
Because the NBN is largely pricing at what prices are now, and we judge that Optus will just sit there with its HFC and keep its price going and claim its margin.
You did address that. All right, thank you. Thanks, Joe.
Okay, Paul, final round of questions.
A couple of quick questions about the SAU. So the consideration of the SAU is presently suspended while you wait for the new one to be lodged, is that correct? How will you think about the issue of the company's plans to have steadily rising average revenue per user over its lifetime? And I'm thinking particularly of the chart that was in the revised corporate plan that came out last week that shows ARPU rising from, I think, around $20, as best you could work it out from the graph in 2012, up to getting close to triple that by about 2020 or 2021.
I'm going to pass to people on my left or right who are closer to the issue.
My understanding of the underpinnings of that are that those projections are based on an assumption that data take-up is going to continue to increase, and that the increased revenue per customer will be largely driven not by access prices, although there will be some move up the scale in terms of higher speed services and high value services, but more predominantly driven by increased CVC revenue, which is the data throughput charge, to get to that number.
So it's a change in the product mix.
Well, it's increased revenue from the data throughput charge driven by increased demand for data throughput.
And just one other question on that. There's been some analysis in a number of quarters that I've seen suggesting that if NBN Co achieves what's in its corporate plan, that's likely to squeeze the margins that retailers face, particularly as the volume of data rises and the payments made by RSPs under the CVC increase. Is that something the Commission turns its mind to as you consider the SAU?
Yes, and it's a very live issue what the trend is rates are going to be in terms of CVC charges over the life of the SAU. NBN Co has recently said that they accept that the price per unit of CVC charges should come down over time. Now that doesn't mean that revenues can't increase because you get more for less basically, or more for more but at a lower price per unit. So I think what those CVC charges end up at and what the trend rate over time is going to be relevant to the margin for retailers in the provision of services.
Thank you.
Okay. We always do this. Yeah. Final question to the man who gave a great speech today.
Thank you. Mr Sims, why does the ACCC de-average its regulated prices on Telstra, such as the 4 bands it has with ULL, but then allow and apparently welcome uniform pricing for the NBN?
Well, let me be clear, we're not welcoming uniform pricing of NBN. We took the policy as a given in making our assessment. There's been a couple of commentators, not anyone here, who've said we were trying to protect uniform pricing. That was not relevant to the decision. We just took it that that's what they decided to do. We haven't endorsed it, we haven't backed it in any way, shape or form. Now, to answer the de-averaging point elsewhere, I'll pass to my colleague on my right.
Well, the de-averaging point goes to the cost differentials between metropolitan and rural areas within Telstra's network. As you know, we price Telstra's network across 4 different bands. Yeah. A vast majority of the costs are in band 4, which is rural and regional Australia. So the issue is not so much with averaging per se, but with an averaging approach which distorts competition.
But I'll say again, there's been a couple of economists who've said our decision was meant to try and protect uniform pricing and avoid cherry picking. Not relevant, not so in any way.
Okay, look, thank you for coming in and giving time tonight. Is it the wish of the committee to authorise for publication, including publication on the parliamentary database, the proof of the transcript of evidence given before it at the public hearing today? Thank you, Deputy Chair. Being no objection, so resolved. I'd like to thank colleagues and witnesses for your time today and declare this public hearing closed.
Thank you very much.
Again.
Thank you.